Well, hello, folks. My name is William the Bastard. Welcome to Defining the Throughout the annals of our human history have been stories of witches, druids, warlocks, goblins, dragons, and all sorts of mythical creatures. In myths, magic was used upon a regular basis, part of everyday life, and for some people, every day of their lives, magic is still being used today. The Celts, the Visigoths, the Vandals, Lombards, Teutons, the Picts, the Vikings. These are the ancestors, our ancestors, of barbarian Europe. And it is from these peoples that derive most of the occultic knowledge, those trickle-downs brought to us that encompass the occult. They would come to call their priests by such names as Gaudi or Druid, witches, priestesses. These ancient ancestors, these spiritual figures of the past. Most sorcery and witchery derive from these sources. Of course, back then it was quite different. The revelry, the freedom, the closeness with nature and the earth, the forest, the ancient oak groves, the cutting of the mistletoe, stone circles, sanctuaries of pagan identity that were slowly ripped away through successive years of invasion and religious persecution. It would be these people that would be the surviving remnant, the left behinds, the leftovers of those long ago forgotten days of yore. Old myths and stories, fables, nursery rhymes, Mother Goose. These were the remnants, these last remaining vestiges of Druidism. Druidism being the native priestly religion of the Celts. Now, all people of Europe have some Celtic blood. It is well documented, even in researching the genome. We find Celtic blood in places exclusively Germanic. And the reason for this is that when Germanic peoples first entered into Europe, the Celts were already there. And so, of course, being human, we all like to fuck. But the Druids have a dark side, being associated with human sacrifice in their lost oak groves long ago. These people that would come to accuse them were the detractors of all things pagan, and were on a mission to stomp out the remains of pagan culture. However, in the countrysides, this was much harder to do. The more remote areas of Europe and the British Isles were, for years, hundreds of years, even into the 13 and 1400s, untouchable by certain missionaries. In the remote highlands, witchcraft was practiced on a regular basis, and some say forms of Druidism lingered on until the 12th and 13th centuries. It certainly is so that today, many of the holidays we observe, even nationally recognized, are remains of the old Druid and witch calendars. Those old pagan calendars of long ago, where the peoples of Europe would get together to congregate and hold contest, horse racing, sword play, the casting of spells, and yes, ritual sacrifice, even of human beings. The Wicker Man being a heinous way to die, some standing 40 feet high, wicker woven basket shaped into the form of a man and loaded with sacrificial victims. Set ablaze in the night, the screams could be heard for miles. A terrible, perhaps unjust way to die. The Druids would most often sacrifice their enemies, people they would capture. The Celtic warriors would apprehend upon their raids, bringing them back, or even warriors that were from invading lands that were taken as prisoners of war. These were offered up as fodder for sacrifice. The holidays in question include such observances today as Halloween, and believe it or not, Christmas. Up until a certain point in time, Christmas was a pagan holiday that refused to die. And it was at these times absolute revelry took place. The courts of Rome closing down altogether for 2 weeks, not holding any cases of legality whatsoever. You ever wonder where Grandma might get those special recipes, those special remedies that aid us when we're sick? Well, many would say that they would carry on through families these special little cures of ailments. And even in your grandmother's medicine cabinet, or in her special recipe for whatever have you, you may find a trace of those ancient lost witch customs which were robbed from us. We have been deculturalized as peoples of Europe. Though now in the Americas, many of our traditions and customs still come from these sources. And speaking on the subject of witchcraft, I find it to be a three-part definition, as there was the witchcraft, the ancient practices of the pagans from yesteryear, long ago, in the primal mist of times. So too, when people say witchcraft, they often mean the practice of magic or the casting of spells. For some people, that is the definition of witchcraft. But also there is another definition, a more modern one, especially when speaking in occultic terms. Witchcraft can be considered a religion known as Wicca. Now, Wicca, or witchcraft, as a religion, began in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s with a person named Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was an occultist who was spawned off of the folkish movements and their circles and covens. Gerald Gardner would write a book called Witchcraft Today, and it would be the first publicized knowledge, the first available book exclusively on the subject of witchcraft. As some of you may have already guessed, just as in Christian religion, there are many branches of Christianity, so too is it true with occultic religions such as Wicca. Wicca derives from folkish beliefs that were handed down generationally, person to person, different established orders, in a focused movement across Europe, which such people as J.R.R. Tolkien himself, author of the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, as well as many others, were involved in this folkism, this this revival of European myth and folklore, improvising on such myths on a personal level, and building them up into a very excellent story that it has set the standard for any kind of role-playing game you might possibly imagine today. Authors like that and others and that had nothing to do with fantasy writing whatsoever were involved in these early focused circles, which actually led to the occultic movement of Nazi Germany, which not all folkism is linked to Nazism whatsoever, but it definitely, it had its ties, kind of like the same thing as Seven-Day Adventist and a Branch Davidian in Christianity. There is a difference. However, this soon developed into more and more complex and specified ritual criteria. Many of the things were developed anew and borrowed from ceremonial magic and classical grimoires of the evocational magics out of the Middle East and other places. Some of it was handed down folk beliefs and what was surviving, the few written sources that survived in Europe that cataloged myths and legends and certain practices, even the way they would go about certain things. That is how we know what we are able to know today about such things as early druids and witches. Now, it was that Gerald Gardner, author of Witchcraft Today, had a student, and his name was Raymond Buckland. Raymond Buckland would come to expand upon the traditions that would encompass Wicca. Wicca, an ever-developing religion and ever more acquiring more and more branches, began with Gerald Gardner. Raymond Buckland, in time, would write several novels upon the subject of gypsy lore, witchcraft, and the occult. He would come to write a book known as the Complete Book of Witchcraft, which gave a very good rendition of history at the beginning, and also would come to compile and expand the many different borrowings that witchcraft would become. Raymond Buckland was also the inventor of a tradition known as Seax Wicca. I've met Raymond Buckland, and I found him to be a very pleasant man and very informative. He also wrote a book, which is my favorite by him, known as Scottish Witchcraft. With the approach of the 1960s and 70s, and the expansion of knowledge and publications upon the subject of witchcraft and the occult, there struck a fever amongst young people of the era, and the first covens in the United States began to form. This would undoubtedly lead to many groups forming in local areas, especially around cities and major municipalities. Witchcraft groups were practically popping up everywhere. Wicca was on fire as it tied into environmental movements and conservation. Much as this was just hype, of course, as there was never really a Wicca eco-movement, so to speak, on a large scale. Wicca is an individualized religion. Furthermore, Wicca is definitely not the ancient witchcraft of the pagan past, and had very little to do with the traditions of the peoples of forgotten Europe.